Hello and welcome to Track Changes. Before we get into this episode, try to imagine an Australia that's slightly different. Imagine an Australia where instead of paying billions of dollars each year to big mining companies that encourages them to use diesel, we pay subsidies to them only if they're electrifying their vehicle fleet. Or to zoom in on one state, imagine that in Western Australia, all large projects had to be born net zero. In other words, they would have to offset all their direct so-called Scope 1 emissions from the day they started operating. That policy actually was in place in Western Australia, but it lasted all of 2 weeks. Or let's go national again. Let's imagine an Australia where an economy-wide price on carbon emissions has applied for more than a decade. Well, that could have been the case in Australia, but instead the carbon price got knocked on the head 2 years after it was introduced. There are only a few reasons why good climate policies don't get introduced or they get knocked out really quickly. And one of those reasons is well-funded, well-connected industry associations that are adept at running public campaigns to slow action and to warn governments off from taking action. In this episode, we'll hear from Christian Downie. Christian is a professor in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University, and he's also director of the ANU's Governing Energy Transitions Lab. As well as teaching at ANU, he's taught at the University of Cambridge and the London School of Economics. Christian has also been an advisor to several government departments, and he's co-edited a new book called Climate Obstruction, which I highly recommend. And particularly relevant to today's chat, he has a strong research interest in how some business associations have stymied good climate policy. Just before we start, you might think it's a given that industry associations representing large emitters and fossil fuel interests are going to play that role. I personally don't think that's the case. If you look at the Australian Aluminium Council, for example, it's publicly faced up to the mammoth task of reinventing itself as a clean industry, a task that has only just begun. And I'd also give a shout out to the South Australian Chamber of Mines and Energy, which has successfully negotiated one electricity bulk buy on behalf of large energy users that led to a major renewable energy contract. And the Chamber has just received competition watchdog approval to enter into another electricity bulk buy contract. And as well, of course, there are a whole lot of industry associations representing groups other than fossil fuel interests and large emitters that do terrific work helping to develop and implement progressive climate policies. Okay, let's hear what Christian has to say. Hello, Christian, and welcome to Track Changes.
Lovely to be here.
First up, could you tell us just a little bit about your work, especially your work in climate change and sustainability? And could you give us a career highlight so far?
Yeah, of course. Well, I guess I've spent the best part, I used to say a decade, but it's probably getting on to 2 decades now, working on the politics of climate change and energy in various government agencies here in Australia, in think tanks and universities here and overseas. And that's taken me from, I guess, sitting in meetings with government leaders in international negotiations. I used to work on the G20. I've spent time interviewing ministers and lobbyists, which we'll talk about shortly. I've done, work holding press conferences, testifying before the Australian Senate or even giving TED Talks. So I've had a kind of career that's gone across different organizations and given a whole lot of opportunities. And I guess there's plenty of highlights or memories through those experiences. But the one I thought perhaps, maybe if I can interpret highlights a little bit as things that have inspired me the most, it's probably been sitting down with students here and overseas to hear not only about their passion for cutting carbon pollution, addressing climate change, but also so many of them are thinking carefully about, what political actions can they take, what research can they do, and importantly, what organizations can they build, I think all of which we're going to need to address, one of the world's most pressing problems, climate change. So it's been those moments when you're sitting in a class with some undergraduate students or talking to some students at a local community group who are just so inspired and enthusiastic. They're probably some of the best highlights of my career to date.
Yes, certainly the actions of young people have been incredibly inspiring. I mean, if you look at that recent decision in the International Court of Justice, for example, a climate change advisory opinion driven by a group of young people from Pacific Islands. So, yeah, certainly very inspirational. Okay, well, let's get to the topic at hand, industry associations, and let's get started with the basics. What role do industry associations play? How do they operate? And why is it important to examine what they're doing on climate change?
Well, trade associations, they're member-based organizations. So they represent commercial firms, and in doing so, they represent the commercial interests of those firms. So in the US, where I've done a lot of work, you're talking about organizations like the American Petroleum Institute, which is one of the largest trade associations, or sometimes we refer to them as industry lobby groups, and they represent firms like Exxon, like Chevron or BP. Here in Australia, some of your listeners will be familiar with groups like the Minerals Council of Australia or Australian Energy Producers, which was previously known as APIA, which represents oil and gas producers. So there's plenty of them. They're common in many countries in US, Europe, Australia. Most OECD countries have quite a lively population of trade associations. It's important to look at them because often firms use them to conduct political campaigns on their behalf, and they often also hide behind them to reduce their risk of reputation damage. So you'll see trade associations, sometimes acting like a bit like a command center, right? Pooling resources across an industry, coordinating different organizations to run a campaign to advance or stop a piece of legislation or a particular regulation. Other times they'll run a media campaign to promote the reputation of industry. So they shape policies in our society, they shape our politics, and in many cases we know very little about them, and I think that's another reason why it's important to look at them.
I guess what you're saying there is that these companies often turn to the associations to say what they don't want to say for reputational reasons. Is that correct?
I think that's true in some cases, particularly when they're running a negative campaign that a firm, especially a firm with a public brand, doesn't want to necessarily be associated with. Maybe they're arguing, for reductions in corporate tax rates or something, and so they're happy for a trade association to run that campaign on their behalf.
All right, well, before we look at what trade associations actually are doing on climate change, what should we expect of them? Like, what do you think industry associations that represent large emitters or fossil fuel interests, what should they be doing to support climate action? Is it enough for them to just sort of sit back and not get in the way, or should they be doing something a bit more positive?
Well, I think you're right. They need to get out of the way insofar as they need to stop, not all of them, but some of them, especially those representing large fossil fuel interests, need to stop blocking action on climate change and get out of the way on that front. That's for sure. But let's take a step back and think a little bit about what drives these organizations. As I mentioned, they're set up by individual firms or corporations to represent their commercial interests. And so in many cases, these trade associations will have, 10 or a dozen members. Sometimes they may even have hundreds of members. But they're often driven by the largest corporations that pay the largest membership dues. So where these organizations get their money from is a firm like Exxon will become a member of the American Petroleum Institute, and each year they'll pay a certain membership due. So if you think about a group in Australia like the Australian Energy Producers, it's a fair assumption to think that some of the largest members of that organization, like Woodside, would be one of the firms driving their position. So it's hard to see Australian Energy Producers, for example, as an industry lobby group, taking a position that doesn't back more gas because it's in the commercial interests of their members, and particularly their largest members, to do so. So to get back to the beginning of the question, I don't think we should set our expectations too high as far as seeing these organizations as becoming advocates for climate action, particularly those ones that are, their mission is to represent emissions-intensive industries. But I do think we can expect, at the very least, that when they're advocating on behalf of their industries, they're doing so based on facts and not spreading misinformation, which many lobby groups do, and is what the Australian Senate inquiry is looking into climate misinformation at the moment. So we do need to better regulate these bodies too, so that they disclose where their revenue is coming from, what they're spending on, and ideally so that they're not spreading falsehoods.
Well, you studied what these associations were doing in the US, and you looked at the amount of money they had at their disposal. And I think you also looked at the sorts of misinformation they were spreading. So tell us a bit about your research, what you were trying to find out, how you went about it, and what you actually discovered.
Well, let me draw on some work, I guess, that I've been doing with my colleague, Robert Brawl, who's based at Brown University in the US. We were motivated to look at trade associations for all the reasons we've just been talking about, particularly because we know that qualitative studies showed, and some of the interviews I've done over the years, where firms talk about them as this command center, this really important kind of cog in a broader influence or political campaign. So we were curious about, how much money do these organizations have? How much money do they spend on politics? So what we did to try and get answers to those questions was we went through the tax filings of these organizations. Now, it's not the most fun work you've ever done, sorting through tax filings, but it provides some important answers. So what we did is we looked at about 90 trade associations in the US, right across the economy, representing oil and gas, utilities, transport, coal, rail, mining, etc., to look at, what their revenues were and what they're spending on. So I should say about 90 organizations that do engage on climate change issues. And what we found over a decade, this is between 2008 and 2018, is that these 90 or around 90 trade associations had total revenues, and this is US dollars, total revenues of $25.6 billion over a decade. So huge sums of money, the better part of 50 billion Australian dollars. So large sums of money. And we've looked at, which sectors, had the most money at their disposal. The oil and gas sector probably won't be a surprise, but its revenues for that decade were 4.6 billion US. Mm-hmm. Others like the utility industry, these are companies, these are trade associations that represent, the industries that generate our electricity. They also had revenues in excess of $4 billion. So these trade associations have large sums of money. And then, of course, the next question is, well, what are they spending it on? Now, trade associations do a lot of things. They provide technical information to members. In some industries, they play a standard-setting role. But we were particularly interested in how much they were spending on politics. And so what we found is that they were spending about 13% of their total revenues on political activities. And what that translated to was, over that decade, $3.4 billion US was being spent by these 90 trade associations on political activities alone. So, that was, I guess to some extent surprising just how much money is being spent on politics in the US. And then the other thing that the nice things about this tax, there's not so many nice things about a tax filing, but one nice thing is you can look at the data about what types of political activities they're spending money on. So a large part of that 3.4 billion, 2.2 billion was going into public relations and advertising. We can talk more about that later, but most of the money was going into political activities around public relations and advertising. That was actually 3 times what they spent on lobbying over the same period. So that was 729 million.
Yeah.
So we're seeing huge sums of money going to public relations, huge sums of money going into lobby, money, millions of dollars, almost 400 million going into grants to other organizations. And interestingly, only a small amount going into political contributions. So of that larger pie of 3.4 billion, just 3% went to political contributions. We can talk a little bit more about that. But as you can see, large revenues, and they're spending, billions of dollars on politics to try and shape policy outcomes around climate and energy policy.
So they're certainly throwing a huge amount of money at to get what they want. Were there sort of differences within various sectors? Like, did you find sectors where the PR spend, for example, was massive, much more than average? Did you see, for example, a massive PR spend by the oil and gas industry compared to the average, proportionate spend by other sectors?
Yeah, well, when we looked across sectors, there was a few interesting things. The first is that those industries that we know tend to oppose climate action, particularly in the United States, that's industries like oil and gas, industries like coal, mining, transport. We know car manufacturers, for example, have traditionally opposed, things like fuel efficiency standards. So when we looked at all the industries that tend to oppose climate change, their revenues were far in excess of the industries that we also looked at that tend to support policy. So we did look at, in our sample of 90 trade associations, we did look at the renewable sector. So we looked at trade associations representing hydro, wind, solar, geothermal, among others. And when we tallied up their total revenues, they were about $580 million. When we tallied up those industries that tend to oppose climate change, it was $14.3 billion. So huge inequities there, $14.3 billion from industries that tend to oppose climate policies versus $580 million for those in the renewable sector. So that was one discrepancy, and perhaps, one insight that makes you think, well, I wonder why some of, the climate movement often in the US is losing the political battle. I think it is a question of resourcing.
It's a structural distortion, isn't it? When you've got,
Yeah.
those wanting to slow action having just been so much better resourced.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And then on the point of where they're spending their money, how that looked across sectors, well, actually most sectors had a large spends on public relations and advertising. And I think one of the reasons for that was a few reasons. I think one, I was surprised by how much money was being spent on public relations when we were tallying up the data. And there's a few reasons for this. One is, buying mainstream media buys to promote your industry is expensive. So if you want to buy television adverts in the California market, it's going to cost you a lot of money. So that's part of the explanation. But I think another part of the explanation is that these industry groups, part of their role in representing firms' political interests is they're there to promote the reputation of the industry. And so often they do a lot of work, a lot of PR to try and ensure that an industry like oil, has a positive image amongst the broader public and amongst political leaders. So they do a lot of work around reputational issues and ensuring that their industry has a strong social license to operate.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I know the study that you did in the US that hasn't been replicated here, but you've been a close observer of how industry associations are behaving here. Do you see any signs that are there any differences in the way, I guess, that US associations operate and the way Australian ones seem to be operating? And I'm talking here about associations that try to slow progress on climate policy. Do you see differences, or is it the same playbook?
Yeah, well, to get to the first part of your question, unfortunately, we can't replicate that type of analysis here, as you mentioned, because we simply don't have the same disclosure practices. So sadly, the disclosure practices in this country, in Australia, aren't as good as the US in many respects. And for example, trade associations here don't have to disclose to the same level of detail how much money they have and where they're spending it. I haven't studied precisely the links between Australian industry groups and US industry groups, but there are some similarities and many similar practices. And I think the reason for this is that firms such as BHP or Chevron or Rio Tinto or Santos or Woodside, the reason they dip into their pockets to keep these industry groups afloat is so that they can engage in a raft of political activities to protect their profits. So think of lobbyists walking the halls of Parliament, or ad campaigns or social media campaigns decrying any attempt to regulate the industry. And so you see these same firms as being members of trade associations in the US and Europe and Australia. So I think it's kind of natural that many of the strategies have some similarities, and they are tailored for different jurisdictions. So the short answer is many of the activities we see come from the same playbook. There are variations, but you see, even in the lead up to the last election, there were media reports that the Minerals Council of Australia, for example, was putting paid staffers in the campaign office of the opposition leader. So this is a type of tactic that we've seen before, and happens around the world as too.
Yeah. And do you see any signs, or have you seen any signs that these US industry associations, the opponents of climate action, are seeking to directly influence things here in Australia?
Well, it's hard to uncover international linkages. The obvious one to look at is when firms disclose their membership as I mentioned, you do know that, some large multinationals will be a member of a petroleum association in the US and a similar association here in Australia. So there's membership overlaps. So there's obviously direct linkages there. And I think it's a fair assumption that they would be sharing information, sharing details on political strategies, even in some cases using the same public relations firms to do their work. But I haven't uncovered particular, examples of where they have, a US industry association has called on an Australian one to do something for it. But as I say, I think it's fair to say that given the personnel overlaps in many cases and the firm overlaps in memberships, you would see a lot of sharing of information and tactics.
Now, you mentioned that your US study can't be replicated here because of there's insufficient transparency here. What would need to happen so that we can get a clear picture of how these industry associations are operating?
Well, on the one hand, we could, ask them to disclose this type of information voluntarily, but I think that's probably a fool's errand. I think what you'd need to do is what happens in some other jurisdictions where it's mandated under their tax codes that if they're going to have, a not-for-profit status or a charity status, which some trade associations do in other jurisdictions, that they have to disclose, what their revenues are, who are the members of their board, how much money they're spending on particular activities. So, in the US disclosures, they have to detail how much money they're spending on lobbying or on particular contracts to different organizations. I think the only way you would get that is if regulations were put in place to make it happen.
And any sign of that?
Well, as I alluded to earlier, we've got this new inquiry that's been set up, a cross-party inquiry in the Australian Senate here in Canberra, and its terms of reference is to look at climate misinformation and its impact on Australian politics. I think in the course of the committee collecting information, one focus will be trade associations. So they'll be doing more hearings later this year, I assume. I think they're due to report back in February next year. So it will be fascinating to see whether one of the things they recommend is improved transparency, but I think we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, hopefully that will be the case. All right, well, look, let's get down to some nitty-gritty on some of the Australian associations because, I don't know whether you agree, but there does seem to me to be some differences, I guess, in the extent to which they play a blocking role or the extent to which, in fact, they play a more sort of facilitative role in terms of trying to get climate action happening. So I guess before we go into some of the most well-known ones, let me ask you, are there any associations that you think are doing a good job in terms of fostering climate action or at least getting out of the way, apart from associations in the clean energy efficiency and carbon abatement space?
Yeah, great question. Well, I can only speak to the ones that I've researched and looked at, and most of them have focused on the energy sector. And so when you look across the energy sector, you might broadly categorize it as kind of three groups if you're thinking about it through the lens of climate policy. You've got those industries, as we mentioned, oil, gas, coal, transport, mining, etc., that have traditionally opposed climate action. And there are some changes there, like utilities, for example, particularly utilities as they shift their asset base away from fossil fuels to generating electricity out of renewables. Their commercial interests change, and you sometimes see their trade associations perhaps shift their position a little bit. But utilities on the whole in places like the US and here still have often lobbied and continue to lobby against climate action. Then on the other end of the spectrum, as you mentioned, you've got renewables industry groupings. We've got some here in Australia. We've got the Smart Energy Council, for example, and others like that do advocate in support of renewable energy policies, again, because that's in the commercial interests of their members. I think the really interesting ones then are the ones that are, so you've got the kind of pro and for and against, so to speak, the ones that are kind of more neutral. And by that, I mean, they engage on climate change issues, but they are not necessarily hardwired to support or oppose. So I'm thinking of industry groups in the finance space, for example, or representing technology firms. They'll sometimes engage on climate issues. And I think it's those industry groups that would be really good for them to, do more in this space, because it's often in their financial interest too to step up, right? I mean, for the finance industry, There's so many reports coming out about growing risk of stranded assets, for example, or risk to the insurance industry from the impacts of climate change. Industry groups representing those firms, I think that's where it would be really, really important for some of those industry groups where their commercial interests to a large extent line up with support for climate policy, that they would get more active in advocating for it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, particularly, I think that there's scope for them to step up, and then they should step up on securing social license for the transition. So many industry associations bang on about EPPC Act reform, to the environmental assessment legislation. I get it. It is crucial. Permitting and approvals and assessments and so on. It has to be working well. There has to be widespread confidence. But it isn't the only license that people need. And it's not enough, I don't think, for industry associations to just leave it to, Chris Bowen and Labor politicians and Greens politicians to sort of make the case for that transition that we need to make. And so it'd be good to see more industry associations step up on that score, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I think if we're going to have, ambitious action on climate change, which is consistent with what climate scientists have been warning us about for decades, we need coalitions right across the society, NGOs, across business, across research communities, across community groups. We need wide-ranging coalitions, and some of the industries we've just spoken about, like insurance, I think, it's probably time that they step up and play a larger role in this space.
Yes. I'm going to name just two associations that I think are doing a good job, and this is apart from organisations, like that actually will operate in the clean energy space and energy efficiency and carbon abatement. And the two that I would name that I've actually got a lot of time for, one is the Australian Aluminium Council, because it does do lots of sort of crunchy work on the transition, and it has shown strong support for renewables, including through clear sort of public fact sheets, and it publicly and strongly recognises the need for that industry to decarbonise. So for me, I'm impressed by their approach. The other I'd name is the Australian Industry Group, which does a lot of detailed analysis and advocacy that recognises the urgency of reaching net zero, while taking into account the economic aspects that need to be brought into play to make it happen smoothly. And it's been a sort of loud and vocal, honest broker, I guess, in public debate. So, I think it's important for people to remember that there are associations out there that raise the bar a bit higher for some of the other ones that are perhaps not so good, which brings me to the Australian energy producers, Christian. So it's just over 2 years since you mentioned their old name, the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association, which represents fossil fuel exploration and production companies. What's your take on that industry association?
Well, it's funny you mentioned the name change, because I remember it was a little while ago, I was reading the newspaper and I saw Australian energy producers, and I hadn't heard that before. I was like, oh, what's this interesting group? And then when I Googled it, I quickly realised it was just a rebranding of the former petroleum group. You actually see this quite a bit, where groups, obviously they get a PR firm to talk about their branding, and they come up with a slightly more neutral name. Clearly having petroleum in the name wasn't considered a good way to promote themselves, and so they've gone with something more neutral like Australian Energy Producers. Look, sadly, I think, Australian energy producers, along with Minerals Council of Australia, have a long history of obstructing action on climate change in this country. As I said, the reason for that is because they're representing the commercial interests of firms that, stand to lose if ambitious climate policies are put in place. So when you've got, when you're representing the interests of a firm like Woodside's going to make more profits if the government stays out of gas markets, lets them export as much as they want, drill for as much gas as they want. Then it's kind of unsurprising that that group then goes and lobbies, and often, vociferously lobbies against a whole range of climate policies. So it's those types of groups that, are really standing in the way. They're not the only ones, but they are some of the key, most well-resourced groups standing in the way of ambitious climate policy in this country.
Yeah. I must say, I mean, you say it shouldn't be surprising. I can't help it. I mean, I guess I'm naive, but I do constantly get surprised by how bad they are. But I am going to start because, I have some thoughts on the Australian energy producers. I'm going to start by saying something that you probably disagree with, but I support their efforts to encourage carbon capture and storage because I think CCS has a limited role to play in reaching net zero. Having said that, I don't think gas companies should get any government money for CCS projects, and I think CCS policy needs to be carefully designed so as not to extend the life of fossil fuel projects. But I do support those efforts. But yeah, generally speaking, I agree with you that the Australian energy producers is playing a very negative role. And, they're always banging on about how people are demonizing gas, fossil gas. It's a phrase that they use frequently. But what's really going on, if they want to use that sort of language, is that they're trying to portray fossil gas as a sort of saintly, unproblematic source of energy. And it's not, saying people are demonizing gas if they criticize it. If people criticize it because it releases greenhouse gases that change and destabilize the climate, it's a bit like saying people are demonizing coal if they criticize coal for the same reasons. To me, it just seems ridiculous.
Yeah, I often find it ridiculous as well. And you're right, I would, we probably would disagree around CCS.
Sure.
Look, I'd love CCS to work, but I guess my concern with CCS is it's kind of, there's two concerns really. One, it's kind of being used as a bit of a rhetorical fig leaf to justify continued oil, gas and coal expansion.
Yeah.
And the other is it just hasn't really worked. So, Kevin Rudd was talking about CCS back in 2007. We had the CCS Institute, I think, I can't remember the exact name, set up here, plenty of government
still
money
going
in it. So we've had the promise. The promise of CCS is always around the corner, but, a bit like the tooth fairy, it's just never there, right? So I worry that CCS is just being used as a kind of, rhetorical device to justify business as usual. I'll give you one example. I was doing some interviews in the US many years ago, and I got interested in Southern Power, or Southern Company. So one of the largest utilities in the US, they've got a huge amount of subsidies from the Department of Energy to set up a CCS plant on their coal-fired generation project down in, I think it was Mississippi or Alabama. It was held up as like, this is going to be the key CCS project to help decarbonize coal-fired powered electricity in the US. And, a lot of people were very optimistic, huge government subsidies. But in the end, it was just one more of these projects, this was about a decade ago, that fell over, both because they couldn't capture all the carbon that they promised, and two, the costs were huge. So, I think we've given that technology a good run, and it's probably time to move away from it, because we do have good alternatives, right? We have perfect alternatives for coal, which is renewables and solar and so forth. So it's been an ongoing debate.
Yes. No, I know what you're saying, and I know I'm in a lonely group, but I'm not presenting it as a sort of a magic solution. But maybe there's one other aspect of what the Australian energy producers does that you would, I think, agree with me wholeheartedly. One of the things that really does my head in with that organisation is that they oppose any effort to rein in gas consumption. I mean, if they really did see gas as a transition fuel on a path to net zero, as they claim to do, then they should be supporting efforts like Victoria's fossil gas substitution roadmap. But instead, they just go into full attack mode. So I reckon they should have rebranded themselves, Christian, as the Australian Fossil Fuels Force Feeders Association, because they just want to keep producing gas and shoving it down people's throats. So I don't know. What do you think of that name? Would that be more accurate?
Oh, with names like that, you've probably got a really big career in a PR firm coming up. That's great.
Let's see. Okay, so you've already mentioned the Minerals Council, and for people who are not particularly familiar with it. It has members including major coal companies, as well as companies like BHP and Rio Tinto. And one of the interesting things about the Minerals Council is it does actually issue a public annual report, which talks about its communications programs and campaigns. And so the latest one, they ran their Get Clear on Nuclear campaign in line with the last election. That didn't exactly go to plan for them. And that report that I mentioned does say that they're boosting their digital engagement and are going to implement greater content diversity to sort of align our digital efforts with evolving industry trends. So your take on and other things, just two other things that the report notes. They coordinate the Fuel Tax Alliance, which tries to protect any erosion of a diesel fuel rebate, which is worth billions of dollars to mining companies. So what's your take on the Minerals Council, Christian?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I hadn't looked at the most recent report, so yeah, thanks for highlighting some of the points in there. I think when thinking about the Minerals Council of Australia, it's useful to think a little bit about the history of some of these organisations. So we know, thanks to some really interesting kind of empirical work done more than a decade ago now, where a former Liberal Party staffer actually wrote a book on what was called the greenhouse mafia, and this was a phrase that members of this group used themselves, and that included groups like the Minerals Council of Australia. So these were lobbyists working for these organisations, where they kind of bragged about in these interviews, just how much influence they'd had over climate and energy policy under the coalition government led then by our former Prime Minister John Howard. And so they played, the MCA along with others, it played a key role in blocking Australia's in Prime Minister Howard's decision not to ratify the Kyoto Protocol. They played a key role going back all the way to the 1990s when Prime Minister Paul Keating was thinking about introducing a carbon tax too. So they've been a key kind of obstructive force on climate change for decades now. And I haven't looked at the most recent reports you're mentioning, but I think if not much seems to have changed in recent years. I think they're being called out more, but they continue, I think, to advocate for a whole range of policies which are going to make it harder for us to reach our greenhouse gas emissions targets, including the one you just mentioned, the diesel fuel rebate. So there's a whole range of policies that the government, could start to think about to really make sure we get closer to this, to the greenhouse gas targets the government has just announced of 62 to, I think, 70% reductions by 2035. But to do that, they're going to need to overcome the political resistance of groups like the MCA.
Yes, and just to be clear, that diesel fuel rebate, basically it's an incentive for big mining companies to keep using diesel and a disincentive to switch, to take on electrification, which is increasingly possible for a range of mining equipment. Now, we've talked about the Australian energy producers, the Minerals Council. You mentioned how they sought to influence and successfully influenced Australia's approach to international negotiations. I wanted to ask you whether you thought those organisations are likely to try and play a spoiler role in COP31, in particular by seeking to undermine any attempt to operationalise the COP28 agreement that countries will transition away from the use of fossil fuels.
Yeah, so it's only recently come onto the international climate negotiations agenda, or the UNFCCC agenda, this idea of phasing out fossil fuels. So these UN climate negotiations started back. They had the very first COP, I think in 1995. I think it was in Bonn in Germany, Berlin or Bonn in Germany. So they started in 1995, and 20, 30 years later, we're only just having discussions now about phasing out fossil fuels. So that's kind of yes, it's kind of amazing, right? That climate change is caused largely by the burning of fossil fuels, among other things like land use change. And yet it took, 30 years almost to have a discussion about phasing out what the products that are causing this problem. So on the one hand, you might say, wow, that those countries like Saudi Arabia and others have done an impressive job of managing to keep that off the agenda. And you would assume that, like they did at previous COPs, like in Azerbaijan, that fossil fuel representatives and countries like Saudi Arabia and other large oil and gas producers will be advocating for, not for language that doesn't say that we're going to phase out fossil fuels, and particularly anything with a timeline attached to it. I think I recalled the last COP in Azerbaijan. I think there was a report done by an NGO that said there was, I think it was 1,700 coal, oil and gas lobbyists who've been granted access to the UN negotiations. So huge number of lobbyists. It'd be interesting to see what it looks like in Belém in Brazil this year, and of course in COP31, whether that happens to be held in Australia or Turkey or potentially even across both countries.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting. I have heard that. I'm aware. I haven't read that study. I'm aware that it was done, but I've also heard criticisms of it, that it was quite sloppy in who it characterized as being, representing fossil fuel interests. And also, I think it is true that COPs do need to be, it just can't be the people who want climate action and their friends. Like it's just not going to work. You do want a lot of people at the table representing different views. You just don't want to make the ones that have got those billions of dollars, that they're hundreds of billions or whatever it is, billions of dollars that they're spending on PR, that they don't dominate proceedings, and that the voices of those that have hardly got any money at all, I guess, to tell their story and make their case, that they get heard and have as much influence, and that's the real challenge.
And I think one of the challenges with these UN-based processes is, they are consensus-based processes.
Yes.
So there's no voting mechanism to reach a decision. So one player like a Saudi Arabia, which has traditionally played this role, is able to veto text, veto agreements. So there's probably, like for a lot of UN processes, a strong argument for changing some of the procedural processes so that perhaps there is three quarters or something of the countries agree to it, then it's binding on all countries. But at the moment it's consensus based, and that's creates some of these problems. And it also is one of the reasons why we still don't have a host for COP31, because although Australia, I gather, has strong support among many countries, it has to be a consensus-based decision.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. The sort of current approach to decision making is looking increasingly dysfunctional. Okay, let's move on our list of Australian associations. So let's turn to the Business Council of Australia. What are your thoughts there?
So the Business Council of Australia is different to some of the other ones we spoke of. What makes the Business Council of Australia different is it's sometimes referred to as a peak body, insofar as rather than representing a particular industry like mining, it represents industries right across the economy, from finance to technology to mining to energy and so forth. So it's got it's a peak body, much like a Chamber of Commerce or even the Australian Industry Group. So it's the way it's organised and the interests it's represent is somewhat different. But what we've seen, I guess, particularly in the last 12 months, is there's been an ongoing debate in the lead up to the debate about what Australia's greenhouse gas target should be. As you would expect in a democracy, there's different groups arguing for different targets. But what we saw the BCA do, and this was reported in a few newspapers, was, and this is kind of an old tactic, I guess, is that you commission some economic modelling to help justify your case. And in this case, basically they'd commissioned some modelling to suggest that, putting in a more ambitious target was going to cost a lot of money. And then they used that report to presumably, walk around the halls of Parliament saying to the government, let's not get too ambitious because this might cost a lot of money. Now, this is a kind of tactic of commissioning economic consultants and setting terms of references and assumptions for modelling exercises to reach conclusions that suit your commercial interests, and then using the conclusions of those modelling exercises to underpin your lobbying effort is a well-worn tactic that's been going on for decades. All industries use it. But the BCA, at least according to media reports, that's one of the tactics that they used recently in the debates here in Australia about what our greenhouse gas target should be.
Yes, I mean, it's certainly true that there have in the past been some very shonky studies seized on by various industry associations to justify a tax on carbon policy. The BCA, I don't know, it's interesting. I mean, I thought the analysis, I didn't look closely at it, but basically it looks at three scenarios. A 50% cut by 2035, a 60% cut by 2035, and a cut of the 70% or more by 2035. And it was released about a month before the government actually announced its target of a 62% to 70% cut range. I thought it didn't bag out going for 70% plus. But to me, the main thing that was wrong with it is that it didn't talk about the huge costs of failing to act and the GDP benefits of action on climate change. And that seemed to me just a terrible omission. And it was explicit about the fact that it didn't talk about those things, and it pointed to previous research that it had commissioned, which did look at those things in a bit more detail. But I don't see how we can take economic analyses seriously that don't provide at least that contextual information, and this one certainly lacked that. I mean, do you think that was a deep flaw?
No, I agree. I think if you're going to have a serious kind of modelling exercise, you need to be looking at both the costs and the benefits. And I think the other thing is, the BCA is not the only group in society that does this type of thing, but I think we need to think carefully about what types of modelling, this goes to debates around misinformation, what types of modelling conclusions we put more trust in. Is it
collusion?
Done?
A slip of the tongue there.
Yes, slip of the tongue there. I guess we need to be wary of modelling, taking too much from modelling that is commissioned by an organisation that has a commercial interest in the outcome of a particular debate. So I'm going to put my faith in modelling done by the Climate Change Authority, an independent statutory body, or the CSIRO, our preeminent scientific organisation. Day and night, I'll put my faith in that, as opposed to putting it in a modelling exercise, a report written by, on behalf of an organisation that really wants a particular outcome out of it. So I think we need to think carefully about the types of evidence
where it's coming from.
Exactly.
I mean, I'm sure there was a lot of interesting information in that analysis. But as you say, the Climate Change Authority, Treasury and so on, they have a lot more resources, and they're much more likely to produce a disinterested assessment. Okay, let's turn not so much to an industry organisation, but to an alliance, a sort of loose alliance. And this is the alliance called Manufacturing Australia. It was formed in 2011 with the aim of campaigning against the Gillard government's carbon price scheme. That's its backstory, and it's got members including BlueScope Brickworks, Dyno Nobel, which I think is part of Incitec Pivot, and Aurora. And it's just launched a website and campaign called Fair Gas Prices, which is designed to win public support for a range of measures to provide more domestic fossil gas at lower prices. What's your take on this campaign?
Yeah, well, I must admit, I wasn't closely across it, but I've actually started seeing it in my social media feed as well lately. So if I think about it kind of with my research hat on, it's kind of interesting. There's a few observations I'd make. The first is often we tend to think, if we're thinking about who supports or opposes climate policy, we often think of business as one unified block. That maybe the business community opposes environmental regulation or opposes action on climate change. And that's not the case, as we've been chatting about. There's firms in the solar and wind industry that have a strong commercial interest in decarbonising and want to promote climate policies. So what you see is when you look a little closer at the business community, there's significant divisions both between industries and also within industries. And I think on the surface anyway, it looks precisely like that's what we're seeing here, that with the current campaign from Manufacturing Australia. In other words, we have lobby groups that represent firms like Woodside and Santos pushing, like Australian energy producers, pushing from a zero regulation on gas and no government intervention in the gas market so that they can continue to make these kind of windfall profits, which I should remind, people, Australians, that they're not paying very much tax on these at all.
No.
And then we have Manufacturing Australia, which, as I said, represents some of those firms. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it represents other big manufacturers like BlueScope Steel and CSL.
Yep.
Large energy-intensive manufacturers. And obviously they believe that the way gas markets are being regulated at the moment means that they're paying higher prices, perhaps, and they have higher costs of production that they'd like. And so you see these splits between different industry groups representing different parts of the business community. And it's often quite interesting because they'll go hammer and tong at each other, these different parts of the business community spending, sometimes millions of dollars campaigning for very different outcomes. So I think it's consistent with the types of things you expect. Again, manufacturers have a very different position than producers on some of these things. But also, as we were talking about previously, I spent a fair bit of time in the US studying these dynamics, and it really mirrors what I saw there. About a decade ago now, there was a big push, for example, by US oil producers to overturn a ban on export restrictions so they could export oil all around the world. So they were busy campaigning for that. Their industry groups like the American Petroleum Institute were busy out there advocating for that. But then you had some refiners that, much like the folk at Manufacturing Australia, wanted lower domestic prices. And so they created a loose alliance to do a similar thing, arguing for keeping as much oil at home and not exporting it because they knew that would mean lower prices and lower costs of production for their refinery. So this is kind of consistent with what you see in other parts of the world too, but it is kind of fascinating to see these divisions across industries that often work closely together on other topics.
It is intriguing, and they're sort of very polite to each other, or certainly Manufacturing Australia doesn't sort of go on a full-throated attack on the LNG companies that were so successfully prevented a domestic gas reservation scheme on the East Coast. But I guess for me, I find Manufacturing Australia deeply disappointing because I don't mind that BlueScope and Brickworks and Cement Australia and whoever else is in it are pressing for a sort of domestic gas reservation arrangement and lower fossil gas prices. Go for it. And it's also important, some of those member companies have got interesting decarbonisation plans in place. But the problem with this campaign that Manufacturing Australia has launched is that basically it leaves people with the impression that, whatever your question or concern is about energy policy or the energy transition or about manufacturing expansion and protecting manufacturing in Australia, the answer is more fossil gas. It's just, it's really, really frustrating. And of course, it's not the answer. Of course, they need gas, at least in the interim. But if companies like BlueScope and Brickworks are going to decarbonise, they not only need fossil gas in the interim, they need lots of renewable electricity. And to me, Manufacturing Australia is the perfect alliance that should be backing in social license for the deployment of large-scale renewables. And I find it really frustrating that as an alliance, it's been a destructive force in climate policy in Australia when it's actually not in its interests either to be like that.
I certainly share that frustration. I mean, particularly for some of these industries where we do have technology substitutes, right? I mean, you spoke about aluminium before, they can generate, get their electricity from cleaner sources. So for industries, particularly manufacturing, where that can reuse renewables and solar, etc., and thinking about that, we need to be decarbonizing these industries as quickly as possible. So it is very frustrating that some of these groups, as you say, I'm parroting you here, right? This is somewhere where we do agree very much that putting out campaigns saying the answer to everything is in gas, I think, is very much the wrong answer.
Yeah, it's very frustrating, and they should step up and do a bit of, help to bolster the social license for renewables. Now, a number of companies put out alignment statements that show, they give their assessment of whether the climate advocacy work of the associations to which they belong is in line with their own corporate stances. Do you have any general thoughts on those, whether they're a good idea, whether they tend to be sort of effective, or what's your take on those?
Yeah, look, it's not something I've looked at closely, and I've heard some other researchers who do work in this space, reflect on some of these things. I think, a bit like you, I think one of the disappointing things is they're often, to the extent that I'm aware of them, they're often kind of incomplete, or they fail to mention the membership that firms have of some groups that they may not want to publicly be associated with. So often that they are very disappointing. And I think this also comes back to that distinction between kind of voluntary disclosures and voluntary approaches versus where you could just have, regulation that says, okay, you've got, firms are mandated to disclose their memberships of other political organizations. So we know who is being funded. So we know, are they supporting groups that are spreading information, that are spreading falsehoods and the like? Because, I think this is really important because in many jurisdictions, we've got, a firm saying, I'm committed to the Paris Agreement, I'm committed to net zero, and yet we know they're supporting some lobby group that's arguing the opposite.
Yes.
So having these statements that are, complete and that are factual, I think is very important so that we can hold companies and others to account for their behavior.
Yeah. And I mean, some of them are problematic. There's one that I found particularly depressing, because I actually have a lot of respect for BHP. I think some people in BHP have been incredibly influential in promoting climate-related financial disclosures, for example, and exploring decarbonisation pathways. But BHP recently put out, or its latest alignment statement, says, we're basically in alignment, and that includes with the New South Wales Minerals Council. But a few months back in June, the New South Wales Minerals Council had an op-ed in the Daily Telegraph. It was under the heading "Lost Jobs, Higher Bills, Worth the Price for Bowen's Ego." And it basically insinuated the government's decision on a 2035 target would be heavily influenced by the government wanting to host COP31, and that the higher the target that was set, the greater the chance that thousands of Australians' jobs would be at risk. And to me, I found it really demoralising that BHP would just say, oh, this sort of advocacy is aligned with its own views. It makes me think the whole notion of these alignment statements needs to be rethought in some way.
Yeah, and this just continues to go on, right? I mean, I think different firms have been called out for their membership with the Minerals Council of Australia as well at different points in time. And often they'll put out a statement saying, look, we're reconsidering our position, but then, you fast forward a couple of years and you look at the issue again and it's the same.
They're back in the
same
game.
Members, sadly, yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, if these firms pulled out of these organizations, then, you wouldn't see this, right? Because the reason the Minerals or the New South Wales Minerals Council has money to do these types of campaigns is because of the membership dues from firms like Rio Tinto or BHP. So they have the financial power to tell these groups, like the New South Wales Minerals Council, not to do this on their behalf. So I think it's time some of these firms called their lobby groups, in and said, this type of behaviour is not, it's not appropriate in the context when we're just seeing the devastating impacts, of climate change all around the world. I think the reports today in the news where that New South Wales is going to have the hottest ever October day, and every month goes by it's some new temperature record and heat wave. So, I don't think we can continue to tolerate this type of behaviour.
No, absolutely. And when I reflect on what you've been telling me, over the course of this chat, it does make me think that shareholders perhaps need to focus more on quizzing companies about the actions of their industry associations, because these industry associations have so much money and because they're so adept at public relations and so on, that maybe that's been, I guess, a bit of an undercooked area that shareholders, could press companies a bit more on. What do you reckon?
Yeah, there are some great groups working on shareholder activism and mobilizing shareholders to do just that. So, and I think they've had some successes, getting really large votes against particular board members and so forth. So I think it's a very productive space, and there's a lot of good people working in that area.
Okay, Christian, well, look, thanks very much, which brings me to my last question. I just have one final question. What fact or insight do you wish was more widely known because it would help us move faster to a cleaner, greener, better world?
Well, I think, the thing that I'd like to, tell people is just that this isn't so much a scientific or a technological problem anymore. It's addressing climate change is really a political problem. And let me explain what I mean by that. We know, because of the path-breaking work of climate scientists, including many at my own university here, the Australian National University, we now understand why the world is heating up, what the impacts are. Because of the work of engineers and entrepreneurs, we actually have almost all the technologies we need to cut pollution and stabilize our climate. Because of the work of public policy folk, we've got most of the policy solutions. But the thing is that we continue to confront what we've been talking about today, which is this political failure. And that's because there are individuals, there are groups in our society, like the industry groups, that are sitting in their offices mapping out quite sophisticated political strategies to defeat climate policies, to defeat attempts to cut pollution. And we have to counter that. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to, provide the type of stable climate that some of the young people that we spoke about at the very beginning of our conversation, so desperately want and have a right to.
Terrific. Well, it's a great call to action, Christian, and it's a great chat. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for having me, Mara.
I hope you enjoyed that chat with Christian, and I think that was a particularly powerful closing point that he made. We largely have the technologies to defeat disruptive climate change. We've got the policy solutions, but we've also got a lot of political failure. And that's in very large part due to some industry groups that are constantly mapping out sophisticated political strategies to defeat climate policies and undermine social license. See you next time.